The gray steel hull of the USS Enterprise CVN-6 cut through the Pacific swells on the morning of December 7, 1941, and aboard that 25,000-ton warship were 800 young men who would witness and document the most savage naval war in human history through the forbidden lenses of cameras they had smuggled past their commanding officers in direct violation of Navy regulations that prohibited personal photography aboard combat vessels, creating an illicit archive of war that would remain hidden in footlockers and sea bags for decades, while official censors controlled every image the American public saw of the Pacific campaign. These men, mechanics and gunners and radio operators ranging in age from 18 to 42, understood that if caught with a Kodak Brownie or a Leica rangefinder, they faced court-martial and the brig, yet they continued to shoot thousands of photographs that captured not the sanitized heroism of Navy propaganda, but the actual texture of naval warfare as experienced by ordinary sailors who lived for months in steel compartments measuring 12 feet by 8 feet, slept in canvas racks stacked 3 high with barely 18 inches of clearance between them, worked 18-hour shifts in engine rooms where temperatures exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and watched their shipmates die in ways that official photographers were expressly forbidden from recording. The Enterprise had departed Pearl Harbor at dawn on November 28, 1941, carrying Marine Fighter Squadron 211 to Wake Island as part of a routine ferry mission that would save the carrier from the devastation that struck the Pacific Fleet 9 days later, when Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers destroyed or damaged 21 ships and killed 2,403 American servicemen in an attack that lasted 110 minutes and transformed the United States from a neutral observer into a combatant nation overnight. Aviation machinist's mate, second class Bruno Gaido, a 23-year-old mechanic from Milwaukee who had enlisted in 1936 seeking adventure and steady pay during the Depression, had secreted a German-made Leica camera in his tool locker before the Enterprise sailed from Hawaii, wrapping the precision instrument in oiled cloth and hiding it beneath wrenches and spare parts where inspecting officers would never think to search. And on the morning of December 7th, when word reached the task force that Pearl Harbor was under attack, Gaido retrieved his camera and began documenting the carrier's transformation from peacetime routine to wartime emergency, with photographs that showed flight deck crews scrambling to arm and fuel aircraft, while radar operators hunched over green oscilloscope screens, tracking incoming contacts. And damage control parties broke out firefighting equipment and sealed watertight doors in preparation for battle that seemed inevitable and imminent. The Enterprise Air Group had launched search patrols at first light that morning, sending 18 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers ahead of the carrier to scout for Japanese forces. And when these aircraft attempted to land at Ford Island and Ewa Field, after completing their patrols, they flew directly into the second wave of the Japanese attack and were engaged by both enemy fighters and friendly anti-aircraft fire that killed several pilots who had survived encounters with Mitsubishi Zeros, only to be shot down by American gunners who could not distinguish friend from foe in the chaos and smoke that engulfed Oahu. Gaido photographed the recovery of surviving aircraft as they landed on the Enterprise deck with bullet holes stitched across their wings and fuselages, capturing images of oil-streaked pilots climbing from cockpits with expressions of shock and rage, while plane handlers counted the missing aircraft, and calculated the butcher's bill from a morning that had cost the Air Group 6 dive bombers and their crews. These photographs, grainy black and white images shot with a handheld camera under conditions of poor light and high tension, showed details that official Navy photographers would have been ordered to omit. The shaking hands of a 20-year-old pilot lighting a cigarette after reporting that his gunner had been killed by a Zero that had pursued him down to wave top level. The blood-stained rear cockpit of an SBD whose radio operator had bled out during the 40-minute flight back to the carrier. The grim faces of deck crews who had lost friends and understood that this was only the beginning of a war whose duration and cost no one could yet calculate. The carrier's captain, a 49-year-old Naval Academy graduate named George Murray, who had commanded the Enterprise for only 3 months and now faced the prospect of leading his ship and crew into combat for which neither he nor they were fully prepared, ordered the task force to steam toward Oahu at maximum speed in hopes of intercepting the Japanese striking force, and for 2 days the Enterprise searched the ocean west of Hawaii while her air group flew combat patrols and her crew manned battle stations around the clock, expecting at any moment to sight the enemy carriers whose aircraft had devastated Pearl Harbor. Guido used these tense hours to photograph his shipmates at their battle stations. 5-inch gun crews standing ready with shells stacked beside their weapons. Fighter pilots sleeping in their ready rooms with flight gear piled beside their chairs so they could scramble on 30 seconds' notice. Lookouts scanning the horizon with binoculars, while the carrier steamed through seas that were empty of Japanese ships, but filled with the possibility of sudden violence. The photographs captured the exhaustion and hypervigilance of men who had gone without sleep for 48 hours, their faces showing the particular strain that comes from extended periods of high alert, when adrenaline eventually gives way to a grinding weariness that makes even the simplest tasks require conscious effort and deliberate concentration. When the Enterprise finally entered Pearl Harbor on December 8th, sailing past the capsized hull of the USS Oklahoma and the burning wreckage of the USS Arizona, where 1,100 men remained entombed in a battleship that had exploded when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine, Guido violated every security regulation in the Navy book by photographing the devastation from the flight deck, creating a visual record of the attack's aftermath that showed details no official photographer would have been permitted to capture. Bodies floating in oil-slicked water between the overturned hulls. Rescue parties using cutting torches to open holes in the capsized Oklahoma's bottom plating in desperate attempts to reach trapped survivors, and the thousands of sailors and dockyard workers who stood on the piers and seawalls watching the Enterprise pass with expressions that mixed grief and fury in equal measure. These photographs, perhaps 24 images shot over the course of 30 minutes as the carrier maneuvered to her berth, constituted evidence of a court-martial offense that could have resulted in Guido spending the war in the Portsmouth Naval Prison. Yet he understood that what he was documenting needed to be documented regardless of the personal risk, that someone needed to create a visual record that showed the true cost of the Pearl Harbor attack without the filtering and sanitizing that military censors would inevitably impose on official imagery. The Enterprise spent 2 weeks at Pearl Harbor undergoing minor repairs and taking on supplies before returning to sea for combat operations that would define the carrier's war and establish her reputation as the most combative vessel in the United States Navy. a ship whose air group would participate in virtually every major engagement of the Pacific Campaign, and whose survival through battles that sank or crippled 4 other American carriers would earn her the nickname the Grey Ghost, and convince many Japanese pilots that the Americans possessed not one but several carriers named Enterprise, since no single ship could possibly survive so many encounters with Japanese naval aviation. During these 2 weeks, Gaido recruited other members of the crew into his clandestine photography operation, identifying sailors who owned cameras and convincing them that documenting their wartime experience was worth the risk of discovery and punishment. And by the time the Enterprise sailed for the Marshall Islands in January 1942, at least 20 crew members were regularly photographing life aboard the carrier, in violation of regulations that had been established specifically to prevent enemy intelligence services from learning details about American naval operations through captured or intercepted photographs. The photographers developed an elaborate system for concealing their cameras and protecting their film from discovery during the frequent inspections that Navy regulations required aboard combat vessels, hiding Kodak brownies inside rolled sleeping bags and wrapping Leica rangefinders in dirty laundry that inspecting officers would be unlikely to examine closely. And they learned to shoot without drawing attention from officers or from those crew members who might report unauthorized photography to the master-at-arms or the ship's executive officer. Aviation Ordnanceman 3rd Class Robert Edwards, a 25-year-old sailor from Oklahoma who had worked as a newspaper photographer before enlisting in 1940, became the group's technical expert, teaching other photographers how to estimate exposure settings under the difficult lighting conditions found aboard a warship at sea, how to brace cameras against bulkheads or equipment to compensate for the carrier's motion in rough seas, and how to frame compositions quickly without the luxury of careful setup that civilian photography permitted. Edwards had smuggled aboard not just a camera, but also a copy of the Leica manual that explained advanced photographic techniques, and during off-duty hours in the ship's machine shop, he held informal classes where sailors learned the principles of depth of field and shutter speed and film sensitivity that would allow them to create technically competent images under combat conditions when there would be no opportunity for second exposures or careful framing. The photographs that resulted from these efforts documented aspects of naval warfare that official Navy photographers were prohibited from recording, or that official photographers simply never witnessed because they were not present during the countless hours of routine operations between major battles, the deadly tedium of life aboard a warship at sea, where the same tasks were repeated day after day in an environment that combined extreme danger with crushing boredom, where violent action could erupt without warning after weeks of monotonous routine, and where men learned to sleep through the constant noise of machinery and aircraft operations while remaining alert for the particular sounds that signal genuine emergencies. The smuggled cameras captured sailors playing poker in cramped berthing spaces where cigarette smoke hung thick as fog, mechanics sleeping under the wings of parked aircraft on the hangar deck because their bunks were stifling hot and the hangar offered slightly better ventilation, cooks preparing meals in galleys where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees and the motion of the ship sent pots sliding across stove tops, and the hundreds of other mundane activities that constituted daily existence aboard a carrier whose crew lived and worked in an environment that was simultaneously monotonous and potentially lethal. On February 1st, 1942, the Enterprise participated in her first offensive operation, when Task Force 8, under Vice Admiral William Halsey, launched airstrikes against Japanese installations in the Marshall Islands, hitting Kwajalein, Votije, and Malalap with bombs and machine gun fire that destroyed hangars and fuel tanks and killed Japanese personnel in attacks that achieved more psychological than strategic impact, but demonstrated that American carriers could strike Japanese-held territory and withdraw without significant loss. Guido photographed the preparations for these strikes, showing ordnancemen loading 500-pound bombs onto SBD Dauntless dive bombers and armorers feeding belts of 50-caliber ammunition into wing-mounted machine guns. And he captured the moment of launch when aircraft roared down the flight deck and staggered into the air with loads that pushed them to their maximum takeoff weight and left them vulnerable during the critical seconds after they cleared the carrier's bow and before they gained enough speed and altitude to maneuver effectively. The photographs showed details that revealed both the complexity and the improvisation that characterized early wartime carrier operations. Plane handlers guiding aircraft with hand signals that had been devised only days before. Flight deck crews working without the standardized colored jerseys that would later identify their specialized roles, and the jury-rigged equipment that American carriers used before war experience led to improvements in everything from bomb hoists to arresting gear. When the strike groups returned to the Enterprise after hitting their targets, Guido photographed the landing aircraft and documented the damage they had sustained during combat over the Marshall Islands. Bullet holes in fabric control surfaces, hydraulic fluid streaming from punctured lines, and shattered canopy glass where Japanese machine gun rounds had narrowly missed killing pilots who would fly again the next day if their aircraft could be repaired overnight. One photograph showed an SBD that had landed with its tail wheel shot away, forcing the pilot to hold the tail up with elevator pressure during the landing rollout, while deck crew rushed forward to secure the aircraft before it could tip back and damage its propeller. And another captured the moment when armorers discovered an unexploded Japanese anti-aircraft shell lodged in the wing of a dive bomber that had somehow failed to detonate despite the impact and the subsequent stresses of combat maneuvering and carrier landing. These images documented the incredible violence of aerial combat and the equally incredible luck that often determined whether pilots lived or died, whether aircraft returned safely or were lost, whether missions succeeded or failed in ways that had nothing to do with skill or courage, but reflected the random operation of chance in an environment where death could come from a mechanical failure or an enemy bullet or simple bad luck that put an aircraft in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The Enterprise spent the next 2 months conducting raids across the Central Pacific, striking Wake Island and Marcus Island, and preparing for the Doolittle raid that would send 16 B-25 bombers from the carrier USS Hornet to strike Tokyo in April 1942. And throughout these operations, the ship's clandestine photographers continued their documentation, while simultaneously performing their regular duties as mechanics and ordnancemen and radiomen. The photographs from this period showed the evolution of the Enterprise crew from a peacetime organization focused on training and readiness into a combat-experienced unit that had learned through direct experience how to survive in an environment where mistakes led immediately to death or injury, where equipment failures could prove as deadly as enemy action, and where the difference between victory and defeat often came down to minor details of maintenance or training that seemed insignificant during peacetime, but became matters of life and death once the shooting started. Edwards photographed damage control parties conducting drills that prepared them for the fires and flooding that would result from bomb or torpedo hits, showing sailors practicing with hoses and pumps and damage control equipment, while damage control officers evaluated their performance and identified deficiencies that might prove fatal during actual combat. And he captured the endless maintenance work that kept a carrier operational, despite the corrosive effects of salt air and the mechanical stresses of continuous high-speed operations that pushed machinery to its designed limits and sometimes beyond. On May 4, 1942, the Enterprise Air Group participated in preliminary strikes during the Battle of the Coral Sea, attacking Japanese shipping at Tulagi and launching searches for enemy carriers that would engage in the first naval battle in history, where opposing fleets never came within sight of each other, and all combat occurred through carrier-based aircraft strikes. The battle cost the Americans the carrier USS Lexington, which was abandoned and scuttled after taking bomb and torpedo hits that started fires her crew couldn't control, but it also forced the Japanese to cancel their planned invasion of Port Moresby and demonstrated that American carrier forces could fight the Imperial Japanese Navy on roughly equal terms, despite the devastating losses at Pearl Harbor just 5 months earlier. Guido did not photograph the Coral Sea battle because the Enterprise was operating several hundred miles from the main action, but he did photograph the crew's reaction when they received news that the Lexington had been lost, capturing images of sailors gathered around speakers, listening to damage reports and casualty figures that made clear the cost of naval warfare in an age of aircraft carriers, and showing faces that revealed the growing understanding that this war would be longer and bloodier than anyone had anticipated in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, when rage and desire for revenge had temporarily obscured the genuine military challenges that defeating Japan would require. 3 weeks later, the Enterprise would fight in the battle that changed the course of the Pacific War, when American carriers ambushed a Japanese striking force at Midway Island and sank 4 fleet carriers in an engagement that lasted from dawn on June 4th until late afternoon, when the last Japanese carrier slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the crew and aircraft that represented years of training and experience that the Imperial Japanese Navy would never fully replace. The Battle of Midway demonstrated the decisive importance of intelligence and timing in carrier warfare, where the side that struck first usually won regardless of other factors, and it validated the aggressive tactics that Admiral Raymond Spruance had employed when he launched his strike groups at extreme range in order to catch Japanese carriers while they were rearming and refueling aircraft and therefore maximally vulnerable to attack. Guido photographed the frantic preparations before the Enterprise launched her Midway strike, showing pilots receiving their final briefings, while plane handlers spotted aircraft on the flight deck and ordnancemen made last-minute checks of bomb fuses and release mechanisms, and he captured the terrible tension visible on every face as men who understood that this battle would determine whether the Japanese advance could be stopped, prepared for combat that would be decided in minutes, but whose consequences would shape the entire course of the war. The Enterprise Air Group suffered heavy losses at Midway, losing 14 dive bombers and 10 of the 32 dauntless pilots who had launched that morning. But the squadron's survivors sank the carrier Akagi and contributed to the destruction of Kaga, striking blows that eliminated 2 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor and reducing Japanese naval aviation capability by a margin that would prove impossible to replace despite frantic Japanese efforts to build new carriers and train new pilots during the year that followed. Gaido photographed the returning strike groups as they landed aboard the Enterprise with fuel tanks nearly empty after the long flight back from the Japanese fleet, showing pilots climbing from their cockpits with expressions that mixed exhaustion and exhilaration and grief for the comrades who had not returned. And his camera captured Air Group Commander Wade McCluskey being helped from his badly damaged SBD after leading the dive bomber attack that had found and destroyed the Japanese carriers at the moment of their greatest vulnerability. McCluskey, a 40-year-old Naval Academy graduate who would receive the Navy Cross for his leadership at Midway, had taken a bullet through his shoulder during the attack and had flown his damaged aircraft back to the Enterprise despite blood loss and pain that would have incapacitated a less determined pilot, and the photograph of him being lifted from his cockpit by deck crew who could see the blood soaking through his flight suit became one of the most powerful images in Gaido's entire collection, capturing the physical cost of victory in a way that official photography carefully avoided. The victory at Midway gave American forces a strategic breathing space and allowed the Navy to shift from defensive operations aimed at preventing further Japanese advances to offensive campaigns designed to recapture territory and push toward Japan itself, and the Enterprise would participate in almost every major engagement of this offensive phase, including the Guadalcanal campaign that began in August 1942 and would continue for 6 months as American and Japanese forces fought for control of a malarial island that held strategic importance far beyond its physical size or economic value. During the Guadalcanal campaign, the Enterprise and her air group would fight in multiple carrier battles, including the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October, engagements that cost the Americans the carrier USS Hornet, but which inflicted such severe losses on Japanese naval aviation that the Imperial Japanese Navy would never fully recover the strike capability it possessed before the attrition battles around Guadalcanal destroyed squadrons faster than training programs could replace them. Gaido and his fellow photographers documented these campaigns with images that showed the cumulative exhaustion of the Enterprise crew as they endured months of continuous operations, punctuated by brief rest periods that were never long enough to allow full recovery. And the photographs revealed the physical toll that combat operations exacted from men who worked and fought and slept in an environment where enemy action was only one of many threats to their survival. On August 24, 1942, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, a Japanese dive bomber penetrated the Enterprise's combat air patrol and dropped a single 250-kilogram bomb that struck the carrier's flight deck just forward of the after elevator, penetrating 3 decks before exploding in a crew berthing space and killing 35 men instantly, while starting fires that threatened to spread to the hangar deck, where fueled and armed aircraft were spotted for launch. Gaido was in the hangar when the bomb hit, and he photographed the damage control response with images that showed the organized chaos of firefighting operations as sailors directed high-pressure hoses into smoke-filled compartments while damage control officers coordinated repair efforts and medical corpsmen treated wounded men who had been burned or struck by shrapnel from the explosion. The photographs captured details that official Navy photographers would never have been positioned to record. The blackened faces of firefighters emerging from smoke-filled spaces after subduing blazes that could have destroyed the ship if they had reached the magazines or the aviation gasoline tanks. The systematic approach that damage control parties used to shore up weakened bulkheads and repair ruptured piping while the carrier continued steaming at high speed and conducting flight operations, and the grim efficiency of corpsmen who treated injured men with morphine and bandages before evacuating them to the ship's medical spaces where surgeons worked under emergency lighting to save lives and repair damage that ranged from minor shrapnel wounds to traumatic amputations. The Enterprise remained operational despite the bomb hit and continued launching and recovering aircraft throughout the battle, demonstrating the remarkable damage tolerance that American carrier designs incorporated and the superb training that allowed damage control parties to contain fires and repair damage quickly enough to prevent minor hits from causing catastrophic losses. The Japanese had scored what should have been a mission kill against the Enterprise, hitting her with a bomb that would have put many ships out of action for weeks or months. But the carrier's crew had extinguished the fires and restored full operations within hours, allowing the Enterprise to remain on station and continue supporting American forces on Guadalcanal, while Japanese commanders believed incorrectly that they had severely damaged or possibly sunk the carrier, and therefore miscalculated the naval balance in the South Pacific. Guido's photographs of the damage and the repairs documented one of the most important but least appreciated aspects of carrier warfare: the ability of well-trained crews to absorb punishment and continue fighting even after suffering hits that would have disabled less resilient ships or ships with less capable damage control organizations. 2 months later, during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands on October 26, 1942, the Enterprise would take additional damage when Japanese dive bombers hit her with 2 more bombs, while torpedo bombers narrowly missed with weapons that would have caused catastrophic flooding if they had struck home. And once again, the carrier's crew would demonstrate their ability to control damage and maintain operations even after absorbing hits that knocked out gun mounts and started fires and killed dozens of sailors who had been manning battle stations when the bombs struck. Edwards photographed the aftermath of these attacks with images that showed the appalling damage that bombs could inflict on a carrier's structure. Steel deck plating peeled back like aluminum foil, bulkheads blown completely away, leaving intact compartments exposed to open air, and the gruesome evidence of what happened to human bodies when they were caught in the blast radius of high explosives. One photograph showed the remains of a 5-inch gun mount that had taken a direct hit, with the gun barrel twisted at an angle that should have been impossible, and pieces of the mount scattered across 50 feet of deck, while the gun crew had simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form, vaporized or shredded by the explosion that had destroyed their weapon. The Santa Cruz battle cost the Americans the carrier USS Hornet, which was sunk after taking multiple bomb and torpedo hits that started fires her crew could not control, leaving the Enterprise as the only operational American carrier in the South Pacific and forcing her to assume responsibilities that should have been distributed across multiple ships. For 2 months, the Enterprise operated alone against Japanese forces that included 3 or 4 fleet carriers, conducting strikes and reconnaissance missions and providing air cover for American ground forces on Guadalcanal, while her crew worked around the clock to maintain aircraft and equipment that were being used at rates far exceeding their designed service intervals. Guido photographed the exhaustion this imposed on the crew, showing mechanics sleeping under aircraft on the hangar deck between 12-hour maintenance shifts, pilots falling asleep in their ready rooms between missions that sometimes launched them 3 or 4 times in a single day, and the general degradation of health and morale that resulted from operating at maximum tempo for months without adequate rest or replacement personnel. The photographs captured what official Navy imagery carefully avoided showing: the human cost of extended combat operations where even victories led to cumulative exhaustion that degraded performance and increased the likelihood of accidents and errors that could prove as deadly as enemy action. By late November 1942, the Enterprise had been operating continuously for nearly a year, participating in virtually every major engagement of the Pacific War, from the Marshall Islands raids through the Midway Victory to the grinding attrition battles around Guadalcanal, and the carrier urgently required overhaul and repairs that could only be accomplished at a major shipyard with extensive industrial facilities. The ship returned to Pearl Harbor and then transited to the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington, where she underwent 3 months of repairs and modifications that included installing additional anti-aircraft guns, upgrading radar systems, and conducting maintenance on machinery that had been run hard for months without proper servicing. Guido and the other photographers documented the overhaul with images that showed the incredible complexity of a fleet carrier's systems: the massive reduction gears that transmitted power from the turbines to the propeller shafts, the intricate piping systems that supplied steam and fuel and fresh water throughout the ship, and the endless cables and wires that connected fire control systems and radar sets and radio equipment into a functioning whole. The photographs revealed the Enterprise not as a sleek warship, but as an enormous industrial facility, whose operation required the coordinated efforts of hundreds of specialists maintaining and operating equipment that ranged from cutting-edge radar technology to mundane but essential systems like laundries and refrigeration plants. When the Enterprise returned to combat operations in the spring of 1943, she joined a carrier force that had grown from the handful of ships that had fought at Midway into an armada that would eventually include more than 100 carriers of various sizes and capabilities, and the strategic situation in the Pacific had shifted from desperate defense to methodical offensive as American industry began producing ships and aircraft at rates that Japanese industry could not possibly match. The carrier participated in strikes against targets across the Central and Southwest Pacific, supporting the island-hopping campaign that bypassed strongly held Japanese positions and concentrated American forces against weaker points where superior naval and air power could achieve victory at acceptable cost. Guido continued photographing these operations, documenting the evolution of carrier aviation from the improvised techniques of early 1942 to the sophisticated procedures of 1943 and 1944, when American carriers operated as coordinated task forces with specialized ships providing anti-aircraft protection, refueling capability, and command facilities that allowed admirals to direct battles involving dozens of ships across hundreds of miles of ocean. The photographs from this period showed how carrier operations had become routinized through experience, with standardized procedures replacing the ad hoc methods of the war's first year, and specialized equipment eliminating many of the improvised solutions that had characterized early operations. Flight deck crews now wore colored jerseys that immediately identified their roles: yellow for aircraft directors, red for ordnancemen, blue for plane handlers, green for catapult and arresting gear operators. And this standardization significantly improved safety and efficiency by reducing confusion during the high-tempo operations that characterized American carrier strikes. Edwards photographed these crews at work, showing the choreographed precision with which dozens of sailors maneuvered aircraft on crowded flight decks where a single mistake could result in a crash that might destroy multiple aircraft and kill everyone involved. And his images captured the professional competence that American carrier crews had developed through months of combat operations that had transformed inexperienced peacetime sailors into veterans who could launch and recover aircraft under conditions that would have seemed impossibly dangerous just 2 years earlier. In November 1943, the Enterprise participated in the Gilbert Islands campaign, supporting Marine Corps landings on Tarawa and Makin atolls, where American forces encountered fanatical Japanese resistance that resulted in casualty rates exceeding 50% among the assault battalions that stormed beaches defended by concrete bunkers and extensive fortifications. Guido photographed the preparation and launch of close air support missions that carrier aircraft flew to support the Marines, showing ordnancemen loading napalm canisters and rockets onto SBD Dauntless dive bombers and F-6F Hellcat fighters that would strike Japanese positions within yards of American front lines. And he captured the return of these aircraft after they had conducted strikes that killed hundreds of Japanese defenders at the cost of several American pilots who were shot down by anti-aircraft fire or who crashed attempting to land aboard the carrier with battle damage that made their aircraft difficult or impossible to control. One photograph showed an F-6F that had landed with half its tail shot away, the vertical stabilizer and rudder completely missing, and the fuselage behind the cockpit showing daylight through dozens of holes torn by Japanese machine gun fire. And the pilot who climbed from this wreck reported that he had lost hydraulic pressure and electrical power, and had landed the crippled fighter by dead reckoning and instinct after his instruments stopped functioning during combat over Betio Island, where Marines were fighting yard by yard to capture an airfield whose strategic value would be measured in the hundreds of American lives it cost to secure. The Tarawa operation demonstrated both the effectiveness of carrier-based air support and the limitations of pre-landing bombardment, as naval gunfire and aerial bombing had failed to destroy most Japanese fortifications despite expending thousands of tons of explosives over several days. And this experience led to significant changes in how the Navy prepared for subsequent amphibious operations, including the use of longer bombardment periods and the development of specialized weapons like napalm that proved more effective against fortified positions than conventional bombs. Guido's photographs documented the aftermath of Tarawa with images that showed the terrible destruction that modern weapons inflicted on both attackers and defenders, capturing scenes of devastation that official Navy photographers would have been prohibited from showing to American audiences who had been told that the war was progressing smoothly toward inevitable victory, but who had not been shown the actual cost in blood and suffering that each victory required. By mid-1944, the Enterprise had participated in strikes across the Western Pacific, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, supporting operations that were methodically destroying Japanese defensive positions and pushing American forces closer to Japan itself. And the carrier had earned a reputation as the most battle-experienced ship in the Navy, with a crew whose combat skills exceeded those of any other American carrier's complement. Guido and his fellow photographers had by this point accumulated thousands of images documenting nearly 3 years of continuous combat operations, creating an archive that showed not only the major battles and dramatic moments, but also the countless mundane activities and routine operations that consumed most of a carrier's time at sea. Edwards had developed an efficient system for processing and storing film, using spare darkroom chemicals that he had acquired through judicious trading with other sailors who wanted photographs of themselves or their friends, and who were willing to exchange scarce materials in return for prints that they could mail home or keep as souvenirs of their wartime service. The darkroom operations were conducted in a small storage space that Edwards had converted into a makeshift photo lab, working by red Safelite to develop negatives and produce contact prints that he distributed to the photographers in exchange for their promise to continue contributing to the collective archive that was documenting the Enterprise's war in unprecedented detail. On October 20th, 1944, the Enterprise participated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history involving more than 200,000 personnel and hundreds of ships engaged across several distinct actions that collectively determined the fate of the Philippines and eliminated the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. The battle demonstrated the dominance that American naval forces had achieved through superior numbers and superior training, as Japanese ships were systematically hunted down and destroyed by carrier aircraft that attacked in waves too large for Japanese anti-aircraft defenses to handle, and too numerous for Japanese fighters to intercept. Guido photographed the launch of strike groups that attacked Japanese battleships and cruisers during the Battle of Samar, showing TBM Avenger torpedo bombers taking off from the Enterprise deck loaded with Mark 13 torpedoes that weighed over 2,000 pounds and reduced the aircraft's performance to the point where pilots had to use every foot of the flight deck to get airborne with their heavy loads. The photographs captured the moment of maximum vulnerability when the heavily loaded torpedo bombers staggered into the air just above stall speed and began their slow climb to attack altitude, flying formations that would approach Japanese ships at low level under heavy anti-aircraft fire that killed dozens of aircrews, but which could not prevent the American aircraft from pressing home attacks that sank or damaged multiple Japanese capital ships. The Battle of Leyte Gulf cost the Japanese 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers, losses that exceeded the combined output of Japanese shipyards over the previous year, and which eliminated any possibility that the Imperial Japanese Navy could conduct further major fleet operations. The battle also marked the first large-scale use of kamikaze tactics, as Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into American ships in suicide attacks that achieved damage out of proportion to the small numbers of aircraft involved. And this new threat would dominate the final months of the Pacific War, as American carriers operated off the Japanese home islands in direct support of the planned invasion that would have cost hundreds of thousands of casualties if it had been executed. Edwards photographed the aftermath of a kamikaze attack on the carrier USS Franklin in March 1945, an attack that killed over 700 sailors and nearly caused the loss of the ship when bombs stored on the hangar deck cooked off and exploded after the kamikaze impact started fires that raged out of control for hours. And his images showed the terrible effectiveness of suicide tactics against large warships whose size made them difficult to miss and whose complex internal systems made them vulnerable to relatively small amounts of damage, if that damage occurred in critical locations. The Enterprise survived the war without suffering a kamikaze hit, despite being targeted repeatedly during operations off Okinawa in the spring of 1945, and the ship participated in strikes against targets on the Japanese home islands during July and August, including attacks on airfields and harbors and industrial facilities that were preparing for the invasion that never came after atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan's surrender. Gaido photographed the crew's reaction when news of the surrender reached the Enterprise on August 15, 1945, showing sailors gathered on the flight deck celebrating the end of a war that had lasted nearly 4 years and had killed more than 100,000 American servicemen, including thousands of naval personnel who had died in ships sunk or damaged during combat operations across the Pacific. The photographs captured joy and relief mixed with exhaustion and grief for the friends who had not survived to see victory. And they documented a moment when men who had lived under the constant threat of violent death for years finally understood that they would survive the war and return home to lives that had been suspended since Pearl Harbor. After the surrender, Gaido and Edwards and the other photographers faced the question of what to do with their extensive archive of forbidden photographs, images that documented the Enterprise's war in detail that official Navy photography had never captured, and which violated regulations that could still result in court-martial despite the war's end. The group decided to keep their cameras and negatives secret, hiding them in sea bags and footlockers during the voyage back to the United States and smuggling them home when the Enterprise was decommissioned and her crew was disbanded in January 1947 after Navy planners decided that the carrier was obsolete and too expensive to modernize for the jet age that was just beginning. The photographers returned to civilian life, carrying with them archives that they would keep private for decades, showing the photographs only to family and close friends, while the official history of the Pacific War was written using sanitized imagery that had been carefully vetted by Navy censors who had removed anything that might undermine public support for the military or reveal details about American losses and casualties that the government preferred to keep quiet. It was not until the 1970s and 1980s when veterans began aging and feeling the need to share their experiences before those experiences were lost entirely that the smuggled photographs began to emerge into public view through publications and documentaries that sought to present a more complete picture of the Pacific War than official sources had provided. Gaido donated his collection to the Naval Historical Center in 1982, shortly before his death from cancer at age 64, and his photographs, along with those of Edwards and the other Enterprise photographers, became part of the historical record that scholars and historians would use to understand not just what happened during the Pacific War, but how the war was actually experienced by the ordinary sailors who fought it from the decks of carriers like the Enterprise. The photographs revealed details that oral histories and official records could not fully capture: the exhaustion and fear and dark humor that characterized life aboard a warship at war, the incredible danger and tedious routine that existed side by side in an environment where violent death could arrive without warning after weeks of monotonous operations, and the fundamental human experience of young men who had enlisted seeking adventure or steady pay or escape from Depression-era poverty, and who found themselves participating in a conflict whose scale and savagery exceeded anything their peacetime imaginations had prepared them to encounter. The smuggled photographs from the USS Enterprise represent a unique historical document that shows the Pacific War from the perspective of participants rather than observers, from men who lived the experience rather than men who documented it from positions of safety and official authority. And these images continue to inform our understanding of naval warfare in ways that official photography never could, because the men who made these images were not trying to create propaganda or maintain morale or present a sanitized version of war, but were simply trying to document their own experience and preserve memories of events and people who would otherwise be forgotten in the vast anonymity of a conflict that involved millions of people and lasted nearly 4 years. Bruno Guido's Leica and Robert Edwards's Darkroom and the dozens of other cameras that were smuggled aboard the Enterprise in violation of Navy regulations created a visual archive that captures the texture and reality of carrier warfare with an authenticity that no official photographer could match, and these images remain one of the most valuable resources available to historians seeking to understand not just the strategic and tactical dimensions of the Pacific War, but the human experience of the men who fought it from the decks of ships like the Enterprise that survived the war against odds that at times seemed impossibly long, and which emerged from the conflict having established records of combat service that no other American warship would equal.